Some mysteries reveal themselves in whispers, others in symbols that refuse to be ignored. Late one night, on an old writing desk, a pool of black ink slowly spread across the page. And then, without a single human touch, it took shape, forming a perfect cross. No draft, no spill, no mistake. Witnesses were baffled. Superstitions grew. But when Sherlock Holmes examined the mark, he knew this was no accident. It was a message. Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, Holmes follows a trail that begins with an ink cross and leads to a revelation far more calculated than anyone imagined. Stay with me till the end, because the secret behind this symbol isn't just clever, it's chillingly precise. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a mystery. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Detectives from all over the world are part of this investigation. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second until the very end. Chapter 1. The impossible crime. Mint was in the chill of an early March evening when the singular affair of the ink crossed first intruded upon the quiet routine of Baker Street. I recall the hour vividly, for Holmes had spent the better part of the day in a brooding abstraction, his long frame coiled in the depths of his armchair, the pipe glowing like a dim beacon in the murky haze that enveloped our sitting room. Outside, the wind scudded along Baker Street with a mournful whistle, rattling the panes like the bony fingers of some restless phantom. I had just laid aside the lancet and was contemplating whether to rouse Holmes from his reverie when a sharp rap came at the door. 3 brisk knocks, each charged with urgency. Mrs. Hudson admitted a gentleman whose manner betrayed both agitation and perplexity. His coat was flecked with rain, and the brim of his hat was bent out of shape, as though his hands had worried it repeatedly during the cab ride. Holmes rose with that feline grace peculiar to him, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the man before a word had been uttered. "You have come from the south, sir," Holmes said, indicating the faint, chalky residue upon the visitor's boots. "Croydon, if I am not mistaken. And you are no ordinary clerk, for your cuff betrays the ink of a scholar rather than the ledger-keeper." The gentleman started as though struck. "By Jove, that is astonishing." "Yes, Mr. Holmes, you are entirely correct. I am Professor Bernard Ellicott of St. Augustine's College, and I come upon the most extraordinary and indeed most ghastly business." Holmes gestured toward the hearthrug. "Pray, compose yourself, Professor, and tell us all." The professor sank into the chair with a trembling sigh. "It is the death of one of my colleagues, Mr. Holmes. Death so unnatural, so utterly inexplicable, that I scarce know how to frame the words. Dr. Adrian Southwell, a fellow of our college and a man of impeccable scholarship, was found lifeless in his chambers this very morning. At first, one might assume some sudden seizure or apoplexy, but no, his body bore no sign of malady. It is what was found beside him that chills the blood." Holmes inclined his head. "Go on." A single sheet of parchment lay upon his desk, Mr. Holmeson, which was drawn across in the boldest black ink. No words, no explanation, only that stark figure. The ink still glistening when discovered, though the door had been locked from within. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of forced entry, and most singular of all, the ink employed was not of any make known to us. It shimmered oddly, as though infused with some metallic essence. And beneath the lines of the cross, the fibers of the paper had been burned, though without the least spark or flame. Holmes, who had been lounging with his long fingers steepled, sat forward abruptly. Burned, you say? Without ignition. Precisely so. And the key to this chamber? In the lock upon the inside. We were obliged to force the door. Most interesting. Holmes' tone had dropped into that deep, vibrating register which I had learned to associate with the stirring of his highest faculties. I could not but exclaim, "Good heavens, Professor! Do you imply that foul play was at work?" The scholar's pale lips compressed. "That, Dr. Watson, is what I fervently wish to know. For there is more upon the dead man's right hand, between the thumb and forefinger. A stain of the same ink was observed, yet no pen was near, nor any vessel containing the substance." Holmes rose and paced the room, his dressing-gown swirling about him like the cloak of some somber magician. "You have with you, I trust, this singular parchment." "I do." Ellicott drew forth a flat envelope, which Holmes seized with the avidity of a hawk stooping upon its prey. I leaned forward, my curiosity inflamed, as Holmes withdrew the sheet and held it to the lamplight. The cross, bold and uncompromising, dominated the page, its arms proportioned with mathematical precision. Yet indeed, as Ellicott averred, the ink gleamed with an unearthly luster, and where the lines intersected, the paper was charred to a brittle crispness, though no margin bore a trace of singeing. Holmes sniffed the surface delicately, then touched it lightly to his tongue gesture. I could scarcely repress a protest against "curious, most curious," he murmured, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Professor, was Dr. Southwell engaged upon any peculiar line of study?" Ellicott hesitated. "Why, yes. He was devoted to certain paleographical researches, deciphering early ecclesiastical manuscripts. He spoke of a monastic cipher that had long defied solution, though I deemed it mere scholarly zeal. Last night I passed his door at 10. There was a light burning, and I heard him moving within. That was the last." Holmes flung himself into his chair with a sudden violence that set the springs creaking. His gaze turned inward, as though some mental machinery had leaped into furious motion. "Watson," said he at last, in that curt tone which admits no delay, "you will pack your bag at once. We take the next train to Croydon." Ellicott uttered a gasp of relief. "You consent to aid us, then?" Holmes' thin lips curved in a wintry smile. "My dear Professor, when an enigma presents itself adorned with a locked door, a dead scholar, and an ink that burns without flame, how could I possibly resist? The game, Watson, is afoot." Chapter 2. The summons to Croydon. The early morning found us once more in the smoky tumult of a London terminus, that perpetual ant-hill where human lives ebb and flow with mechanical regularity, indifferent to the tragedies that send their black ripples outward across society's surface. Our cab clattered to a halt before the great glass roof of Victoria Station, and within minutes Holmes and I were ensconced in a first-class carriage, the Professor opposite us, his countenance drawn and harrowed by a vigil of sleeplessness. I could not but marvel at my companion's composure. Holmes reclined with his long limbs thrust out, his chin upon his chest, and his eyelids lowered until one might have thought him sunk in slumber. Yet I knew from the faint flicker of those lean fingers drumming an inaudible tattoo upon his knee, that his brain was already spinning its delicate web from the raw threads of circumstance. The rhythmic throb of the engine and the blur of the suburban villas lent a hypnotic monotony to the scene. I seized the interval to extract such particulars as Ellicott could supply. "You spoke, Professor," said I, "of your colleague's interest in certain ciphers. Was he alone in this pursuit?" "Wholly so," Ellicott replied, with a glance that bespoke some inward conflict. Dr. Southwell was a man of singular tenacity. He had, I believe, convinced himself that these obscure manuscripts contained matters of vast importance, though, for my part, I deemed it mere scholarly enthusiasm run to seed. What was the nature of these texts? I pursued it. Fragments of medieval Latin preserved in our college library. There were whispers of a sect, long since extinct, whose symbol was, he hesitated, a cross wrought in black pigment upon vellum. A trifle, perhaps, yet Holmes' eyes opened suddenly, twin gray lanterns piercing the gloom of our compartment. "A cross, you say?" Ellicott inclined his head. Holmes made no comment, but the faint upward twitch of his thin nostrils was more eloquent than words. I recognized the sign. The quarry had left a scent, and this Dr. Southwell, Holmes continued in his dry, level accent. Was he a man of means? By no means. A modest income from his fellowship, nothing more. Habits? None that I know. His life was a cloistered one. Books were his world. Yet, Holmes mused, a world wherein the oldest passions may find fresh soil. Ambition - avarice - fanaticism - these flourish as rankly in a library as in a market stall. Ellicott stirred uneasily, and for some minutes no sound broke the stillness save the drone of wheels and the hiss of steam. I confess, a chill crept upon me as I pondered the ghastly picture his words evoked. That quiet scholar, snatched from the calm of his lamplit study by some agency, subtle as it was deadly, leaving behind that mute enigmata, and the cross that spoke of darker ages. At length, Holmes rose, stretched his limbs, and fell to pacing the narrow corridor like a caged panther. "You say the door was locked from within," he said suddenly. "Bolted and keyed, sir," returned the professor. "It had to burst, and the windows fastened by the inside catch. The casements look upon a sheer descent of 30 feet to the quadrangle paving." Holmes smiled grimly. "So much for the demon theory, Watson. Our murderer, if there be, preferred solid masonry to wings." Ellicott uttered a nervous laugh, which jarred upon the somber tenor of our thoughts. "You spoke of the ink," Holmes resumed, resuming his seat and fixing the professor with a hawk-like stare. "You are prepared to swear that it is of no commercial make?" "As prepared as a chemist of 30 years may be, Mr. Holmes. Its constituents defy analysis. There is iron, certainly, and some trace of argent, but alloyed with an element unknown to our tables." Holmes' lids drooped once more, veiling the steel beneath. "An ink that burns without flame, a symbol older than heraldry, and a dead man locked in his cell of learning. An appetizing morsel, what say?" I ventured some commonplace of assent, though, in truth, my faculties were still groping in that mental fog wherein I so often find myself when Holmes spreads his luminous wings and soars into regions beyond my ken. The train slackened, jolted, and drew up with a long, sighing breath beneath the roof of Croydon Station. A raw wind swept the platform, laden with the mingled odors of coal smoke and damp earth. Our conveyance awaited us, and in brief space we were rattling over the ill-paved streets toward St. Augustine's College, a grim Tudor pile whose weather-stained towers loomed like sentinels above the naked elms. It was a strange, impressive edifice, with its mullioned windows and ivy-clad buttressized edifice that seemed steeped in the very essence of tradition, silent, secretive, and aloof. The echo of our footsteps in the vaulted passage, the chill breath of the cloistered air, and the low murmur of voices that died away at our approach, all these wrought upon my fancy, until the prosaic errand of a coroner might, well, have seemed the prelude to some medieval tragedy. Somber figure advanced to meet us, a tall, cadaverous man in a scholar's gown, whose lantern jaw and deep-set eyes bespoke ascetic vigils. He said, in a voice that croaked like a rusty hinge, "I am Dr. Atherton, warden of this college." This lamentable business, Holmes cut him short with a courteous gesture. "Later, sir, later. Lead us to the scene." Without more words, we followed our guide along a dim corridor, up a spiral stair worn hollow by generations of sandaled feet, and so to a narrow landing where a constable stood sentinel. The key grated in the lock. The door swung inward, and I found myself upon the threshold of that fatal chamber. Even now the memory rises before me, the low-ceiled room, paneled in blackened oak, the litter of books and papers strewn in wild disorder, the cold gleam of a shaded lamp casting grotesque shadows upon the walls, and there, half fallen from his chair, his head thrown back in an attitude that was less repose than frozen terror, lay all that was mortal of Adrian Southwell Holmes. Neither spoke nor stirred for the space of a full minute. Then, with that cat-like swiftness which never failed to thrill me, he dropped onto his knees and began his silent pilgrimage about the chamber, eyes darting, fingers groping, nostrils every sense strung to its utmost tension. For myself, I could but stand and watch, with that mingling of awe and helplessness which was ever my portion when the master craftsman plied his art. Chapter 3. The first clues. Shadows in the study. For a long interval, no sound saved the faint drip of moisture from the ivy without disturbed the stillness of that somber chamber. Holmes had passed from the body to the littered table, then to the hearthrug, now stooping till his aquiline profile was silhouetted against the lamplight, now rising to sweep the cornice with a hawk-like glance. His progress was as noiseless as it was swift, and so absorbed was he that when at last he spoke, the sudden vibration of his voice caused me to start like a guilty man. "You observe nothing remarkable, Watson?" I stammered forth, some commonplace, touching aspect of the corpse. Indeed, the sight was one to haunt the imagination. Southwell had been a man of middle years, spare of frame and scholarly in mien. Death had not softened the harsh lines of his ascetic face. Rather, it had fixed them in a grin that was less mirth than menace. One claw-like hand clutched the arm of his chair, the other hung limp, with the forefinger extended as though in accusation. His eyes, glassy yet dilated, stared toward the far angle of the room where a black shadow crouched upon the paneled wall, the shadow of the cross, the door. "Watson, the door," cried Holmes abruptly. "What do you make of that?" It was of stout oak, fitted with an ancient mortice lock and a heavy bolt, both now shattered by the force that had driven the entrance. Upon the inner surface, faint yet unmistakable, was a smear of inky black, the print of fingers hastily withdrawn. A sign of struggle. I was scared, possibly, but note the height, fully 5 feet from the floor. Our assailant, then, was no dwarf, nor yet a woman of low stature. There is something more. See how the stain tails downward in a hairline thread. It was wet when applied. Then it was deliberate. Holmes smiled, that enigmatic smile which ever provoked more questions than it appeased. Without further comment, he wheeled about and crossed to the writing table, where a chaos of folios and loose quires lay tumbled as though by a hurricane. Among the litter stood an inkhorn of antique pattern, its neck encircled by a crust of black deposit. Holmes lifted it, sniffed, and set it down with a gesture of distaste. "Curious, most curious," he murmured. "Here is ink such as I have never encountered. Observe its surface like oil upon a stagnant pool, yet viscous as pitch. And here," he indicated a half-written sheet upon which certain words sprawled in a crabbed hand. "What do you make of that?" I bent above the page. It was in Latin, but such Latin as my old schooling enabled me to decipher. "Crux nigra signum quod revelabit." "The black cross," I translated slowly, "a sign which shall reveal the gate." The remainder was blotted by a splash of the same ominous fluid. Beneath, where the paper had curled and blistered, the oak of the table showed a dull stain, as though seared by some subtle corrosion. Holmes' keen gaze followed mine. "A writing medium that eats its way through cellulose and lignin," he mused. "The recipe, Watson, the recipe would be worth a king's ransom to certain chemists I could name. But we wander. The pen, if you please." He pounced upon the object. As he spoke, a quill of raven feather, stained to the nib with the sable liquor. Holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger, he examined the point through his lens, then glanced toward the hearth. "There lies our next enigma," he said softly. A heap of gray ashes smoldered upon the iron dogs, where some score of charred scraps bore witness to a holocaust of papers. Holmes stirred the embers with the tongs, isolating fragment after fragment, scrutinizing each with that relentless patience which has turned the tide of many a desperate case. At length he drew forth a morsel no larger than a postage stamp, yet bearing upon its brittle surface a device that arrested even my inexpert Aja cross, boldly limned in black, its arms widening toward the extremities, after the manner of a Maltese emblem. Holmes slipped it into his pocketbook with a sigh of satisfaction. "Our ghost grows corporeal, Watson. We have here the spoor of human intelligence, not the caprice of chance." Professor Alec, who had hitherto hovered in the background like a man who fears to wake from an evil dream, now ventured a tremulous query. "You believe, then, that these things, this," he pointed with a shrinking finger to the dark symbol on the wall, "are the work of a sane agency?" "My dear sir," returned Holmes, with a sudden rasp in his tones, "sanity is a relative term. A man may be sane upon 19 points, and mad upon the 20th. The world is full of such hybrids. But pray to compose yourself. Your colleague did not perish by supernatural means, of that I am persuaded. Flesh and blood planned this thing, and flesh and blood shall pay the reckoning." The words fell like steel upon the hush. Ellicott moistened his lips as though to speak, then checked himself with a visible effort. "You had something to add," Holmes prompted suavely. Nothing of the moment," stammered the scholar, his eyes wavering from Holmes' gaze. I scarce know what I think." Holmes shot me one of those lightning glances which serve him for speech. Then, turning upon his heel, he began a fresh perambulation of the apartment, his head thrown back, his nostrils distended like those of a hound upon the scent. Suddenly he halted before a narrow casement draped in moldering arras. Sweeping aside the fabric, he examined the stone sill, the iron catch, and the leaded panes, inch by inch. At last his long forefinger darted to a minute discoloration, a speck no larger than a midge, yet sharp and black against the gray. "Aha!" The cry leaped from him like a spark from steel. "What's the lamp?" I obeyed, shading the wick that its light might fall full upon the spot. Holmes bent low, his lens glittering in the beam. Then, without a word, he drew from his pocket a slip of thin card, scraped the particle from the stone, and sealed it in an envelope which he docketed with scrupulous care. "What is it?" I whispered, caught in that spell of awe which his silences ever bred. "A seed." "Whatsina seed," he answered, in the hushed tones of a man communing with his own brain. "Whether of crime or chance, time shall show." Meanwhile he straightened himself, his face alight with that cold fire I knew so well. "Meanwhile, we have work before us, Dr. Atherton. You will oblige me by summoning every inmate of this college who had a speech with the deceased within the past week. I desire to see them, one by one, in the library alone." The warden bowed in grave assent. "You perceive the significance, Watson." "On my honor, I do not." He smiled a smile that was all blade and no sheath. "Then reserve your judgment, my dear fellow, for the game is afoot." Chapter 4: The Gathering of Suspects. A somber chamber lined from floor to cornice with folios whose dust had lain undisturbed since the reign of Queen Anne. A fire smoldered sullenly upon the hearth, casting a dull glow upon the long oaken table where Holmes had established his headquarters. There, with his lean frame drooping like that of some great bird of prey at rest, he sat in an attitude of negligent ease that ill concealed the vibrant energy within. Before him lay a blank sheet, a goose quill, and a small phial of black ink, which he had requisitioned with curious insistence. One by one, I watched them narrowly, my senses strained to the utmost, for already the shadow of that ghastly thing in the study lay heavy upon my spirit. The first was Professor Ellicott, who had summoned us to this grim vigil. He bore himself with the dignity of his calling, yet I marked how his hands shook as he adjusted the points of his academic gown. His eye would not meet Holmes's. Rather, it wandered restlessly from the fire to the shelves, and then to the arras that curtained the door. When questioned, he could add little to what he had already imparted, that Southwell had supped alone, that he, Ellicott, had passed the door of the study at 9:30 and heard no sound, and that the alarm was raised only when the better, seeking to close the shutters, had found the lamp burning far past midnight. Next came Mr. Pritchard, the bursar, short, florid person with small, glittering eyes that belied the geniality of his smile. His speech was smooth, almost oily, and he had a trick of rubbing his plump hands together as though washing them of invisible stains. He professed the utmost horror at the tragedy. Yet I could not divest myself of the notion that some undercurrent of emotion, whether fear or triumph, stirred beneath his well-fed exterior. I had accounts to balance, said he, in answer to Holmes's incisive queries. The Michaelmas bills, you understand. I was in my own rooms until near 11, and afterward in the Battery. Indeed, I can produce witnesses to that effect. Holmes bowed with a politeness that was a mask. Pray do so at your convenience, said he, and his eyes traveled past the bursar as though dismissing him from the page of life. The third figure was one to arrest attention by the very reason of its contrast. Mr. Cyril Morton, fellow and lecturer in comparative antiquities, was a stripling, scarce 30 years of age, with the mobile features and nervous hands of an artist rather than a scholar. His dark hair fell in disordered waves upon a brow lined with the tracery of thought, and his great luminous eyes had in them the haunting of some inward terror. You knew Dr. Southwell well. Holmes's tone was level, almost languid, yet I saw how his glance pierced like a rapier. As well as one may know the dead, returned the other bitterly. He was my superior, my critic, my enemy, if you will. He thwarted me at every turn, denied me the chair I had earned, made my life a burden of petty humiliations. His voice broke upon the word. Then, mastering himself by a visible effort, he added, "Yet, before heaven, I would not have harmed him." Holmes inclined his head without comment, and his quill traced a noiseless line across the blank sheet before him. Last of the quartet came Miss Ada Fenwick, the warden's niece and housekeeper of the collegiate presence, as unexpected as it was arresting. Tall, supple, and clad in some dark fabric that shimmered like watered silk, she moved with the grace of a creature born to courts rather than cloisters. Her eyes, deep as forest pools, met Holmes with a calm that was more disquieting than confusion. Yet once, when his question touched upon the hours before the crime, I saw a swift dilation of the nostrils, a flutter at the white curve of her throat. "I was in the warden's lodge," said she, in a voice that might have belonged to bronze bells for all its richness. "Professor Ellicott will bear me out. I had letters to write, letters of no moment. I retired at about 10, and after that, I heard nothing save the wind. The wind, indeed. It had moaned like a thing in pain through the quadrangle that night, but there was something in her utterance, a cadence only that set my pulses leaping with vague surmise. When the last had withdrawn, Holmes sprang to his feet with the suddenness of a steel trap released. His thin nostrils quivered, his gray eyes shone with the cold fire of intellectual passion. "Watson," said he, "have you ever stood upon the threshold of a labyrinth and felt the breath of its darkness in your face? That is my posture now. Threads, my dear fellow, threads, fine as gossamer, yet strong enough to hang a man. And somewhere at the core the Minotaur waits." "You suspect one of these four," I ventured. He laughed not mirthfully, but as a man laughs when the scent is hot. "I do not suspect, I know. But knowledge is not proof, and proofa, that is the crucible in which conjecture is transmuted into fact." He turned to the fire, and for a space his long fingers played idly with the poker, sketching strange symbols in the ember, symbols that to my mind bore an uncanny likeness to a cross whose arms widened like those I had seen upon the charred fragment. "Come," said he at last, with a sudden access to energy. There is enough air of ink and parchment here to choke an army. We must breathe the night wind, Watson, and then a little experiment of my own contriving. The game, as I remarked, is indeed afoot. Chapter 5. The First Suspects. The red herring the following morning broke raw and mist-laden, with a sullen drizzle that painted the ancient college walls in streaks of iron gray. Holmes and I were scarcely seated at breakfast when a peremptory rap resounded upon the door, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was ushered in, his sharp ferret face aglow with professional importance. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson, I trust I do not intrude upon your meal, but I come with news that will, I fancy, cut the ground from under this mystery." Holmes, lounging in his chair with an expression of languid amusement, motioned the detective to a seat. "Pray enlighten us, Lestrade. We are ever the debtors of your penetration." The little man flushed slightly, but his vanity was proof against sarcasm. Drawing a paper from his breast pocket, he slapped it upon the table with an air of triumph. "There, Mr. Holmes, is what I call a tangible clue. It was discovered in the ash-bin at the rear of the buttery burnt. A fragment of a note. And what does it say? 'Tonight, after prayers, Southwell must not. The rest is charred away.' But the inference is plain as daylight." Holmes lifted the scorched scrap between his long fingers and regarded it with a gaze so keen that I could have sworn the paper must wither beneath it. "A remarkable survival," he murmured. "And you infer that some person had a deadly grudge against the deceased and intended to silence him that very night. Now, who could that person be? Who but Cyril Morton? You saw him yesterday, the agitation, the resentment he scarcely troubled to conceal. He quarreled with Southwell over the antiquities grant, and the note proves premeditation. I have already learned from the porter that Mr. Morton was seen crossing the quadrangle at 10 o'clock. That fits with the hour. Motive, opportunity, evidence, it's as neat a case as I could wish to handle." Holmes regarded him with that inscrutable smile which so often heralded the discomfiture of Scotland Yard. "Your zeal, Lestrade, is admirable," said he. "May I inquire what steps you propose?" "Steps? Why, to arrest Morton forthwith. A man with a temper like that, why, it's written in every line of his face. And when I have the handwriting experts match the script on this fragment to his letters." Holmes raised a languid hand. "You have specimens of his writing?" "A score. He's been corresponding with the Bodleian these past months." "Then by all means submit them," said Holmes sweetly, "though I confess the experiment will scarcely detain me." Lestrade stared. "You think I'm wrong?" "I think," replied Holmes, rising and tossing aside his cigarette, "that if you arrest Mr. Morton this morning, you will have the felicity of apologizing to him this evening. Come, Watson, we will visit the buttery." The ash-bin in question lay at the far end of a cloistered passage, where the rain dripped mournfully from the stone guttering. Holmes stooped over it with the absorbed delight of a naturalist bending above some rare specimen. Presently he pounced upon a tiny cylinder of gray, what seemed but a flake of charred paper, yet which he cradled in his palm as tenderly as though it were a jewel. "Observe, Watson," said he, with that quiet note of triumph which always set my nerves tingling. "The fibers of this ash do fine for ordinary ragstock, a peculiar glossiness, as I suspected. This was no common note, but a leaf from Japanese vellum such as is employed for palimpsests. And where in Cambridge do we find palimpsest? In the library of St. Anselm's, and nowhere else. A forgery, then? A blind, my dear fellow, blind clumsily contrived to turn suspicion upon Morton. Whoever casts this scrap knew that the police would leap at the bait. Lestrade. He thrust the ash into an envelope, scribbled a memorandum upon his cuff, and turned toward the court. His eyes had the hard glitter of steel. His lips were a mere line. "Holmes," I cried, falling into step beside him. "You speak as though you knew the hand that set this snare." "I know this much," he answered curtly, "that the author of that fragment is a scholar who reckoned upon ignorance, yet left behind him the very hallmark of his craft. Give me until nightfall, and I shall show you a man who would burn vellum to dust and human life with it if thereby he might preserve a secret." When we regained our chambers, Lestrade was pacing the floor like a thwarted hound. He snapped. "Have you discovered something better than a signed confession?" Holmes's bow was the essence of courtesy. "Only a trifle, Ash, my dear Lestrade, ash and inference. But if you value your credit, you will postpone the arrest until I have completed a little experiment. In the meantime, oblige me by keeping the suspects within call." The inspector bit his lip. "You've queer methods, Mr. Holmes, queer and high-handed, but have your way. Only mind this, if Morton bolts, the responsibility's yours." "He will not bolt," said Holmes quietly. "Men who dream in palimpsests seldom bolt, save into the deeper labyrinth of their own devices. Come, Watson. The wind veers east. I have a notion that its breath will stir the embers of more than vellum ere the day is out." Thus ended a morning of bafflement and suppressed excitement, as we stepped once more into the dripping quadrangle. I felt as one who gropes in darkness, while some unseen guide threads the maze with unerring step. That Holmes was upon a scent I could not doubt. Yet what scent, what quarry? These were riddles that mocked the utmost of my conjecture. Only one thing was clear beneath the placid surface of that ancient college. There lurked a force, malignant and cunning, a force that had already struck once, and might strike again ere the ink upon its sinister token had faded from our minds. And even as I mused thus, a thought like ice slid through my brain. What if the hand that penned that note still waited, restless, within those ivy-mantled walls? Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency. The remainder of that gray forenoon Holmes spent in an occupation so singular that, had I not long schooled myself to his eccentricities, I might have questioned his sanity. Seated, cross-legged, upon the hearthrug, he ranged before him an array of trifles gleaned, as I supposed, from the scene of the crime, a few flakes of ash, the scorched scrap of vellum, and most oddly a tiny smear of what seemed wax, scraped from some polished surface. From time to time he bent above these relics with a powerful lens, muttering to himself in that low monotone which always signified intense mental preoccupation. Meanwhile, the drizzle deepened into a steady downpour, and the court beyond our windows lay veiled in drifting curtains of mist. The hollow clang of the chapel bell floated mournfully across the quadrangle. It was a setting in harmony with the somber enigma that overshadowed us. At length Holmes rose abruptly, shook the gray dust from his hands, and reached for his violin. which he tucked beneath his chin with a gesture almost caressing. The melancholy strains of a saraband stole through the chamber, soft, haunting, vibrant, with an undercurrent of suppressed energy. "You play like a man who waits," I said. He smiled faintly. "And so I do, Watson, wait for the one thing needed. When it comes, the pattern will declare itself as clearly as these strings proclaim their intervals, and that one thing, a word, a movement, glance, it will not delay." His prophecy was fulfilled within the hour. Shortly before luncheon, a knock sounded, and the porter entered bearing a tray upon which lay a small sealed packet. "For you, sir," he said. "Left by one of the undergraduates, wouldn't give his name." Holmes took the packet without change of feature, though I observed that his fingers tightened upon the cover. Breaking the seal, he drew forth not the letter I had anticipated, but a key of curious workmanship, attached to a scrap of card upon which was scrawled in a hurried hand, "If you know the truth, seek the door behind the picture in the North Library, but come alone." The signature was wanted. Holmes regarded the key with that peculiar narrowing of the lids which I had learned to interpret as the sign of some inward illumination. "North Library behind the picture," he murmured. "So our adversary grows audacious. Very good, Watson. We will humor him, though not quite upon his terms. Put on your hat. There is no time to lose." The North Library of St. Anselm's is a somber hall paneled in oak and dimly lit by lancet windows of greenish glass. The rain beat sullenly upon the casements as we entered, our footfalls echoing hollowly along the flags. At the far end hung a picture of imposing size, a medieval Madonna, dark with the smoke of centuries. Holmes crossed to it without a word, his movements as swift and sure as those of a hound upon a hot scent. Running his fingers along the molding, he pressed sharply at one point. The massive panel swung inward upon a concealed hinge, revealing a narrow door of blackened oak. "The key, Watson," said he, quietly. I handed it to him in silence. My pulse quickened as the words turned with a rusty groan. Beyond yawned a stair of stone, winding downward into darkness. A breath of air, cold and stale, struck our faces. "Bring the lamp," said Holmes curtly. Down we went, down a flight, so worn that the treads were hollowed like old gravestones, down into a crypt-like chamber whose roof was a groined arch lost in shadow. Here were shelves laden with vellum-bound folios, their titles eaten by mold, tables strewn with fragments of parchment, and, in one corner, a brazier half filled with ashes that still retained a faint warmth. Holmes darted to it, plunged his long fingers among the cinders, and drew forth something that gleamed dully in the lamplight, a lump of fused metal, twisted and shapeless. "Watson." His voice rang sharp as a pistol crack. "Do you mark this? Lead molten." And here he swept his hand across the table, a fragment of cipher, scorched yet legible. Scytha Greek characters interlaced with Syriac. No ordinary college exercise, this. A brain fevered with some desperate purpose has toiled here through many a night. I bent above the scrap. But what connection can this have with Southwell's death? That, my dear fellow, is the very knot we are about to untie. But note this first. The brazier was replenished within the hour. Someone has visited this crypt since morning. And here he stooped suddenly, lifting a tiny pellet from the floor, a globule of sealing wax, scarlet, clinging to a thread of silk. That Watson is our key, our master key. For Southwell's desk bore traces of wax, yet his papers were fastened with wafers. Ergo, some sealed packet passed through his hands ere he died, a packet whose loss means ruin, and whose recovery means what you have seen. His eyes gleamed with the cold fire of triumph. For a space he stood motionless, the lamplight striking his hawk-like profile, the shadows clutching about him like specters from the dead centuries that haunted that crypt. Then, with a swift gesture, he extinguished the flame. Back to the light, Watson. The net tightens. Before another sunset, the hand that struck Southwell shall write its own confession, though the ink be the blackest in the wells of human guilt. As we regained the upper air, the chill of the stair still in our bones, I was conscious of a new and sinister gravity in Holmes's bearing. He spoke little during our walk across the quadrangle, but once, as we passed beneath the dripping cloisters, he paused and laid a hand upon my sleeve. "Remember this, Watson," said he in a tone that thrilled me by its intensity. "There is in that college today a man who fears not discovery, because he fears nothing on earth save the thing that drove him to the deed. Tonight the last mask will fall. Till then," and with that he strode on, leaving me dumb with wonder and not a little awe. For in his eyes I had read the light that shines only when genius grapples with darkness, and triumph is near. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. Evening had descended upon the college with a pall of mist that clung to the ancient walls like a shroud. Lamps glimmered faintly through the drizzle, and the sound of our footfalls seemed muffled as Holmes and I retraced our way to the porter's lodge after that singular descent into the crypt. Holmes was silent, his chin sunk upon his breast, and I knew better than to disturb the whirl of thoughts that must have been revolving in that extraordinary brain. When, at last, we gained our rooms in the outer quadrangle, he flung off his wet coat and threw himself into the armchair with an air of suppressed excitement. Lighting his pipe, he drew deep draughts, the blue spirals wreathing about his sharp features like the fumes of some wizard's incense. "It moves, Watson," he said suddenly. "The thing moves at last. Till now it has been but the shadow of a case. Tonight we shall feel the substance." He broke off abruptly as a knock came at the door. It was the porter, his ruddy face gone ashen beneath its tan. "Beg pardon, gentlemen," he stammered, "but there's trouble, grievous trouble, in the east wing. Professor Harkness's gone, Sir Clean vanished from his rooms." Holmes sprang to his feet. "Vanished? Since when?" "Since an hour ago. They found his door locked, and when they broke it open there was no sign of him. Only this." He held out a slip of paper, damp with the porter's perspiring clutch. Holmes snatched it and held it to the lamp. The message was brief, scrawled in a hand that trembled with haste. "To seek the truth is to perish. Let none follow. No name, no clue beyond the sinister warning. Lead us there," said Holmes curtly. The professor's chambers were on the second floor, overlooking the misty court. A group of pale-faced dons and inquisitive undergraduates clustered at the threshold, their whispers stilled as we entered. The room was in disorder, books strewn upon the carpet, a chair overturned, the curtains trailing in the damp wind from an open casement. But of the occupant there was, indeed, no vestige. Holmes moved with swift precision, his eyes darting from point to point. noting trifles that to my duller sense seemed negligible, a smear upon the sill, a dark drop upon the hearthrug, the faint impression of a heel in the ashes by the fender. "Watson," said he, in a low tone, "observe the soot crushed here by a man's knee, beyond question, and hear the mark of a cord upon the iron bar of the window. He went out, yes, but not by choice. Then he has been abducted." Holmes' lips tightened. Abducted, or worse. "Look at this." From beneath the littered table he drew forth a fragment of cloth, black serge, torn and frayed as though by violent strain. Upon it clung a thread of scarlet silk, the same, he cried softly, the same that I found in the crypt. "The skein runs straight, Watson, straight to the heart of this infernal coil." His eyes blazed for an instant, then grew cold and hard as tempered steel. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to the anxious group, "I beg that none will enter this room or disturb a single object. The authorities shall be advised in due course. For the present, silence is the most charitable course, silence and patience." And with that, to their manifest astonishment, he drew me away and down the stairs, nor spoke again until we stood in the cloistered gloom without. The rain had ceased, but a chill wind moaned among the buttresses, and the mist hung heavy as a pall. Holmes paced the flagged walk with quick, nervous strides, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his head bent like one communing with his own soul. Suddenly he halted and gripped my arm. "Watson," he whispered, "do you recall Southwell's lips, that purple tinge, the swollen veins? I tell you, the same hand has struck swifter this time, before fear could loosen its hold. But why, Harkness? Why not another?" Unless he broke off, his face whitening to the lips. "Good heaven! If my surmise be true, there is one life hanging by a hair at this instant. Come quickly, for God's sake." He dragged me across the quadrangle, through a potturn, and into a narrow passage that wound like a burrow beneath the college. The air grew foul, the stones clammy to the touch. At last we emerged into the crypt we had quitted scarce 2 hours before. Holmes flashed the lantern into its recesses. The place was empty, save for the litter of charred vellum, the cold brazier, and what made my blood run cold, the fresh imprint of feet in the dust, leading to a door at the far side. A door of iron that gaped an inch upon its hinges. Through that gap came a sound that froze the marrow in my bones, a low, stifled moan, faint as the wail of a dying wind. Holmes was across the floor in 2 bounds. He wrenched the door wide and leaped within. I followed and stopped short with a cry of horror. Upon the stone floor lay a man bound hand and foot, his features distorted by agony, his lips flecked with foam. Beside him stood a small brazier from which rose a sickly sweet odor that turned me faint. "Quick, Watson, the gag. He's alive, barely. Brandy, water, anything." Between us we dragged the victim, an elderly fellow, as I now perceived, into the outer air. Holmes bent above him like a surgeon, his lean fingers loosening the cords, his keen nostrils quivering as he sniffed the fumes that clung to the man's garments. "Chloroform, yes, but more than that," he muttered. "There is something subtler, here, something devilish. Pray heaven we are in time." He looked up suddenly, and in his eyes I read a fire that I had seen there but twice before, the fire that leaps when Sherlock Holmes has measured his foe and knows that the hour of reckoning draws nigh. night. "Watson," said he, in a voice that thrilled me to the core, "the hound is at bay. The next move is mine, and God help the guilty soul that made this play for silence." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The college bell had tolled the hour of midnight where we quitted the sick room. Thanks to prompt remedies and copious draughts of brandy, the unfortunate fellow one, Dr. Ellison, had been wrested from the very threshold of death. He lay now in a heavy stupor, his breathing labored but regular, while the nurse from the infirmary watched at his side. Holmes lingered but a moment to assure himself that life held, then drew me into the dimly lit corridor. "Watson," said he, in that low, tense voice which with him betokened the birth of some masterstroke, "our adversary is bold, desperate, tonight. He has staked everything upon a final throw. The man fears detection, yet dares fresh crime. That is the courage of despair. He will strike once more, and soon, unless I forestall him." "You speak as though you knew the man," I exclaimed. "I know this much," he returned grimly, "that he walks even now beneath these roofs, cloaked in a reputation of learning, perhaps even of piety, that he counts upon the timidity of his associates and the sanctity of these ancient walls to shield him, and that, before the dawn breaks yonder, he shall play his hand under my eye." He turned suddenly, his thin lips relaxing in a cold smile. "Come, Watson, we must bait the trap. And to bait it, we must first plumb the mind of our quarry. That is the true field of battle." Within the half-hour we stood in the great hall where the dawns were wont to assemble. At that late hour its vast expanse was in gloom, save where a solitary lamp flung pools of radiance upon the oaken board. Thither Holmes had summoned certain of the fellows, under pretense of official inquiry. One by one they entered the venerable dean, stooping and tremulous. Young Fawcett, keen-eyed and restless. Gray, the mathematical tutor, heavy-jawed and saturnine. And last, Sir Adrian Southwell Urbane, faultlessly arrayed, yet with a furtive flicker in his glance that did not escape Holmes' hawk-like eye. "My friends," began Holmes suavely, as we gathered round the board, "this unhappy series of events lays upon us a duty to probe, with all frankness, the possible causes. You, who know the life of this foundation, can aid me. Why should men of high culture stoop to practices of secrecy?" The dean raised a shaking hand. "Sir, such things are unthinkable. Our college has ever stood for Holmes," waved the protest aside with courteous impatience. "Yet facts, my dear sir, are stubborn. Manuscripts destroyed, a fellow struck down by violence, another vanished utterly. These are grim realities. I seek light, not rhetoric. You, Mr. Gray, what say you?" The tutor started, his heavy brows knitting. "Superstition, societal folly. The crypt hath ever had its tales of spirits. Some madman hath taken them to heart." "A sane madman, then," murmured Holmes dryly, "since he wields both pen and poison with equal skill. And you, Mr. Fawcett?" The young man flushed to the temples. I can hazard no theory, save that Professor Harkness had enemies." "He wasn't compromising enemies." Holmes' voice was soft as silk. "And what shape did their enmity take? A word, a look, perhaps something so slight that only a watchful eye perceived it." Fawcett's lips moved, but no sound came. A bead of sweat glistened on his brow. Holmes regarded him for an instant with inscrutable gaze, then turned to Southwell. "You, Sir Adrian, are silent." The baronet inclined his head, his thin smile flickering. "Because, my dear sir, I perceive whither your thrust tends. You suspect among us some monstrous complicity. Pray dismiss the fancy. The college is no nest of assassins. If crime lurks here, it is from without, from the world that envies our cloistered peace." "A fair suggestion," Holmes rejoined smoothly. "And yet," he broke off, his keen glance flashing from face to face. "Gentlemen, I thank you. I shall trespass no longer on your courtesy. But before we part, suffer me one small request. Each will be so good as to sign his name upon this slip purely for the sake of form." From his pocket he drew a sheaf of paper and a pencil, laying them carelessly upon the board. One by one they complied, the pencil passing from hand to hand. I, who watched with some wonder at this trivial formality, saw Holmes gather the slips with an air of polite indifference, and thrust them into his breast-pocket. As the last footfall died along the corridor, he wheeled upon me with a low chuckle. "The fish rose, Watson, the fish rose splendidly. Did you note Southwell's wrist, how the vein throbbed as he wrote? Or Gray's grip upon the pencil tense as steel? Ah, but the master touch was yonder youth's pallor when I spoke of enmity. 3 clues, my dear fellow, nay, 4. For here," he drew forth the slips, "here lies the crux." He held them beneath the lamp, scanning each in turn with eyes that glittered like a falcon's. Then, with a sudden exclamation, he sprang to his feet. "Watson, the net tightens. Another hour, perhaps lessened, we shall strike. Till then, silence and vigilance. For mark me," his voice sank to a whisper that thrilled along my nerves, "the man who wrote this line walks even now with death in his soul. Tonight will test which of us is the finer player." And with that he clapped his Inverness about him and strode forth into the darkness, leaving me torn between awe and apprehension at the drama whose last act was even now preparing behind those ancient walls. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The college lay steeped in midnight hush, its ancient courts silvered by a waning moon. From the chapel tower the quarter chimed faintly, and the sound floated ghost-like through cloister and quadrangle, dying among the ivy-clad walls. All honest life was sunk in slumber. Yet in that solemn stillness I moved at Holmes's side, my pulses quick with a sense of impending doom. "We are watched, Watson," he murmured, as we paced the shadowed arcade. "There by the buttress. Did you mark the stir of that gown? The fox scents danger. All the better." His tone was almost exultant, though his eyes, shining under the brim of his hat, told me that every faculty was strung to its utmost tension. In his left hand he carried a stout malacca cane. His right hovered near the pocket that hid his revolver. For myself, I confess that more than once I glanced behind, half expecting some stealthy shape to glide from the darkness. Presently we reached the small postern that opened upon the Fellows' garden. Holmes pushed it softly ajar, and we stepped forth upon a strip of turf glimmering white with dew. Beyond rose the mound beneath which yawned that sinister crypt scene of the vanished scholar's last known footsteps. A faint mist curled along the grass like wraiths of the dead. Holmes stood motionless, his head bent in listening. Then, with a swift gesture, he gripped my arm. Hark! From the black mouth of the crypt there came a sound of faint metallic clink, followed by the stealthy scrape of stone upon stone. Another instant, and a shape loomed bending, groping outlined against the deeper blackness. Something gleamed in its grasp, and the dim starlight struck upon a face masked to the eyes. "Down, Watson." Holmes' whisper was like the hiss of a serpent. In the same breath he sprang forward, lithe as a tiger, his long arms flashing. There was a muffled cry, the crash of a lantern shivering on the stones, and the two were locked in desperate grapple. I dashed to his aid, but even as I reached them, the intruder tore free by some convulsive effort and darted headlong across the grass. Holmes snatched at his skirts, missed by a hair's breadth, and next instant we were racing through the garden in furious pursuit. How the fellow ran! Like a phantom he skimmed the dew, his gown streaming behind him, his footfalls scarce stirring the silence. Twice I thought we had him. Twice he swerved, doubling among the EUs with the cunning of a hare. Then, as we burst into the outer court, there came a sudden clang. The great gate. "He'll make the lane," I gasped. "He'll try," panted Holmes. Faster, man, faster. But even as hope flagged, fortune flung us aid. A dark figure loomed in the gateway, a porter, roused by our cries. The fugitive swerved to avoid him, stumbled on the uneven cobbles, and in that instant Holmes launched himself like a bolt. The two went down together with a shock that sent the gravel flying. And when I reached the spot, Holmes was on his feet again, his lean face pale but triumphant, his sinewy hands gripping the prisoner by either wrist. "Light, Watson, quick." I struck a match with fingers that shook, and the yellow flame leaped up. By its glare I saw the white oval of a mask, the gleam of eyes that blazed with baffled fury. A quick wrench, and Holmes tore the covering. Awathan fell back with a cry that was half of triumph, half of incredulity. "You—" The name died upon his lips, but I, peering over his shoulder, stared aghast at the countenance thus laid bare. Countenance I had seen but a few hours earlier, bending with courteous gravity over the oaken board in the hall. "Watson," said Holmes in a voice that thrilled like a struck wire, "the drama nears its close, but not here. Back, we must shield our captive from prying eyes. Another act awaits ere the curtain falls." 10 minutes later, we sat within a little paneled chamber that opened from the porter's lodge, the door locked, the lamp burning low. Our prisoner disarmed, disheveled, yet preserving an air of desperate defiance, occupied a settlement in the corner, while Holmes, erect and sardonic, surveyed him with eyes that seemed to pierce the very marrow. "You played boldly, sir," said he at last, in a tone that cut like steel, "and for a space you held the winning cards. But one flaw, one slight, unconscious trick of the hand, and the whole edifice crashed. Shall I tell you where you erred?" The other's lips curled in a smile of deadly irony. "Spare your rhetoric, Mr. Holmes. You have the body, make what boast you will. The game is done, done. Nay, sit begins. You hold one secret still, yet I shall pluck it forth, though I dig to the roots of your soul. For mark me," and here his voice sank to a note so deep, so menacing, that the very air seemed to vibrate, "another life hangs upon your silence. Speak, hand, who knows, some shred of mercy may yet cling to you. Refusen by heaven, you shall drain the last bitter dregs of justice." The man sat mute, his jaw thrust forth, his eyes like points of flame. Holmes regarded him for a breathless moment. Then, with a shrug that veiled more than it revealed, he turned to me briskly. "Watson, the dawn is at hand. Till noon I must guard this gentleman as I would a coffer of gold. After that the gathering, for I swear to you, before the sun sets, the black heart of this enigma shall lie naked to the light." With that, he drew the shutters, set the lamp higher, and flung himself into a chair. His face hard as chiseled marble while, without, the first faint stir of day crept ghost-like through the cloistered courts of St. Simeon's chapter. 10. The true motive begins to surface. The pale gray of dawn was filtering through the chinks of the shutter when Holmes at last rose from his chair. He had sat motionless for hours, chin sunk upon breast, brows drawn in a dark line of thought. Our prisoner, huddled in the corner like some fierce creature at bay, had not stirred, save for a twitch of the lip or a smoldering flash from those defiant eyes. The ticking of the little mantel clock sounded loud as hammer blows in the tense silence. Holmes crossed the room and stood before the man with folded arms, his gaunt figure towering like an accusing wraith. "You are obstinate, sir," said he slowly, "yet obstinacy, like courage, is a virtue that may destroy its owner. I will put the case plainly. Within these walls you may wrap yourself in silence, but beyond them beats the voice of law, hoarse and hungry for its prey. You struck one blow and struck shrewdly, but when you raised your hand again, that was madness. For, had your second stroke not failed, I should now be sitting in yonder crypt with a bullet in my heart." The man's lips curved in a bitter sneer, but he spoke no word. Holmes's eyes kindled with sudden fire. "You doubt my knowledge, fool. From the hour I saw the ink upon that dead man's fingers, I traced your shadow through the cloister, across the quad, into the very sanctuary of your secret soul. Ink, sir. A tiny smear, shaped like a cross. What human weakness could have left such a token? Vanity, the vanity that will hang you by the neck if you mock me longer." Still no answer. Holmes wheeled upon me with a gesture of impatience. "Watson, note this picture well. A scholar, nurtured in the cloisters, a gentleman of bearing and of brain. What drives such a man to deeds that stink of the dock? Money, Shaw. His gown hides no tattered lining, perhaps a fiercer passion than gold, and one that breeds deadlier sins, or hates low, brooding hate, such as festers in the dark like a canker in the bone. Between those two love and hate lies the key to yonder silence." He swung back upon the captive, his voice leaping like a whip. "Which was it, sir? Love or hate?" The man started as if stung, and for one fleeting instant the mask of iron cracked. I caught the quick heave of the breast, the flicker of anguish in the eyes. But with the strength of desperation he rallied, and his answer came low and hard. "You may hang your guesses on the gallows, Mr. Holmes. They'll swing as high as I." Holmes regarded him with a strange, cold smile. "So be it. I shall not press you yet. The law will speak more harshly than I, and I am no advocate of torture. But mark me well, sir. The path you tread runs straight to the gallows foot. A single step aside and, who knows, the blackness might thin to gray. Reflect." He turned abruptly and beckoned me to the door. When we stood in the little flagged passage, he laid a hand upon my sleeve, his eyes gleaming with the fierce joy of battle. "Watson, the pieces fit the motive, shapes itself like clay beneath the sculptor's fingers. Yet one hollow yawns, still the why of it all, the monstrous why. To snatch the fruit, to trample the blossom, there lies a tale of such venom as I have seldom smelt. And I shall pluck that tale from its burrow, though I rake St. Simeon's to the roots." We stepped forth into the quadrangle. The early sun was smiting fire from the gilded vane upon the chapel spire. A mellow chime floated down from the belfry, but for me the peace of the scene was mockery, for my thoughts ran dark with that grim figure crouched in the porter's lodge and the shadow of doom that clung about him. Holmes paced at my side with head bent, his long fingers twitching in that nervous dance which told of brain surge with thought. At last he spoke, low and swift. "There is a woman in this coil, Watson, and a woman of rare power, else yonder scholar had never leaped the bounds of law. Mark the ink, again the cross, sign of the altar. What link joins a cloistered student and a holy symbol drawn in haste by dying fingers? I tell you, the roots strike deep into passions that mock the chill of stone and rubric. Before night falls, I must drag those roots to light." "And the prisoner?" I asked. "He stays till noon, close warded. Lestrade comes with a warrant, and till then our friend shall taste the discipline of solitude. Meanwhile, Watson, there is a certain vestry key that clinks in my memory, a ledger that may whisper secrets if fingers are cunning, and a woman's name. If but I could hear that name spoken." His words broke off in a sudden laugh, not of mirth, but of fierce exultation. He clutched my arm, his eyes aglow. "The chase quickens. Come, man, there's blood in the wind, and by St. George, I'll hunt it down, though the trail wreaths through every cloister in Christendom." 2 hours later found us in the dim hush of the college library, that stately chamber whose carven stalls and dusky shelves held the garnered lore of centuries. Through the painted casement the morning sun fell in slanting bars, dust-moted, lighting the somber ranks of volumes like mailed warriors at rest. Holmes moved among them as a hound moves through covert, swift, silent, unerring. Twice he drew forth a tome, riffled the leaves with flying fingers, and replaced it with a grunt of disdain. At the third essay he paused, and a low cry of triumph broke from his lips. I bent above the page he thrust towards me. It was a register, its ink faded, its margins scrawled with cryptic symbols. Holmes's finger stabbed at a name, and under that name, in a woman's hand, a phrase that leaped like flame from the yellowed paper. "For the cross and for his sake." Holmes closed the book softly. Yet in his eyes burned the light of the hunter who sights his quarry through the break. The curtain rises. "Watson," he whispered, and behind a drama red as the heart's own blood. He slipped the volume beneath his arm and turned with that swift, panther-like stride I knew so well. Back to our prisoner. The hour strikes, and the truth shall ring like steel on stone. Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes' grand strategy. The shadows were lengthening across the quadrangle when Holmes re-entered the porter's lodge. His step was light, almost buoyant, and the lean face wore that inscrutable smile which to me was as the glitter of steel ere the thrust. Our prisoner sat in sullen stillness, save for a slow grinding of the jaw that spoke of the tempest raging within. Holmes advanced with a courteous inclination, as though greeting a guest at Baker Street rather than a man fettered by his own silence. "Your composure does you credit, sir," he said smoothly. "Few men could look the gallows so squarely in the eye without flinching. It argues philosophy and perhaps faith." The man's head jerked up, a flicker of something fear or wrath lighting his dark gaze. Holmes, marking it, leaned against the oaken settlement, his fingers steepled, voice purring like a cat at play. "I have spent an hour, my dear sir, in that noble library where your name shines among the record of honors. A proud roll, indeed, a name linked with fair promise, bright hopes." And yet his tone sank to a note of silken menace, a name that soon may dangle like a broken leaf from the tree of life. Unless. He let the word fall like a stone in a well, and the silence that followed was tense as drawn steel. Then, with a sudden gesture, he flung a paper upon the table. "Read." The man bent, slowly, as though dragged by some irresistible chain. His eyes scanned the crabbed writing, those fateful words that Holmes and I had read but an hour ago. "For the cross and for his sake." A low sound broke from his throat-knot speech, but a gasp as of one who sees the grave open at his feet. Holmes watched him as a falcon watches the flutter of a snared bird. "You know the hand that penned that line," said he softly. "You know the voice that whispered its va, and the eyes that gave the pledge it holds. For their sake, sirrah, for yours speak." But the man's lips only writhed in a ghastly semblance of a smile, and his answer came hoarse and broken. "You play your game, Mr. Holmes. Play it out." Holmes straightened, and in that instant the mask of suavity fell from him like a cloak. His eyes blazed, his long arms swept wide in a gesture that was command and menace in one. "So be it. You have chosen. Let the choice stand. But mark this, sir. Within the hour your name shall ring through St. Simeon's like the tolling of a knell. I hold the threads, and I shall weave them to a noose that shall tighten round your neck while you smile. For, though you front me now with pride, you shall cringe, yet too shall writhe as the steel grips." He wheeled, beckoning me with a jerk of the head, and strode into the chill dusk of the cloister. I followed, my heart beating high with excitement, for I read in his fierce eyes the glow of some desperate venture. Once beyond earshot, he halted and gripped my shoulder. "The hour is ripe, Watson. We strike while the iron smokes. That man holds fast good. I shall loosen his tongue with a lever. Tonight I bait my trap with a woman's name." He thrust the register beneath his cloak and set his face toward the vestry. His voice, when next he spoke, was low and vibrant. "There is one who prays yonder in the shadow of the altar, a woman whose soul hangs trembling between heaven and hell. She shall choose her path ere midnight strikes, and her choice shall snap the last link in this chain of blood. Come, Watson, the game quickens to the final cast." And with that, his lean figure swept down the echoing aisle like a phantom hunter gliding to the covert where the quarry lurks. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The vestry door creaked softly as we entered. A dim light glowed from a single taper upon the altar, throwing long, spectral shadows across the flagged floor. At the far end, kneeling upon the chancel step, was the figure of a woman slender, motionless, and draped in somber black. Her hands were clasped, and the pale oval of her face gleamed like marble in the gloom. Holmes paused for an instant, his keen eyes devouring every detail, then advanced with that noiseless tread which seemed rather a gliding than a step. I followed more heavily, my boots clanging upon the stones with a harshness that jarred upon the hush of prayer. The woman started, and her head turned swiftly. The light fell upon features of delicate molding features that had once known laughter, but now were lined with care and shadowed by some unuttered dread. Her eyes, wide and luminous, fixed themselves on Holmes with a look wherein surprise and terror strove for mastery. "You know me, madam?" said he quietly. "And you know why I am here?" A low cry broke from her lips, a cry as of one smitten by a blow unseen. She rose, swaying like a reed, and grasped the rail for support. "For God's sake," she whispered hoarsely, "not here, not before his altar." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Then let the truth speak where falsehood dies." For there his long arm swept toward the dark recess beyond the organ. "Lies the shadow of a man who will hang for your silence. One word from you, and the rope falls idle. One word, and you pluck a soul from the pit. Will you speak that word?" Her breath came quick and short. Her hands worked convulsively upon the rail. Then, with sudden passion, she flung herself at his feet. She sobbed, "He is innocent before God. He is innocent. You hunt him as a beast, yet his blood is clean. I will tell you, olenly swear, he shall not die." Holmes bent, lifted her gently, and set her in the high-backed chair by the vestry door. His face was softened now, and his voice had the grave tenderness of a surgeon soothing a child. "Compose yourself, madam. I pledge no man's life yet. I pledge you justice. Speak without fear. What is this tie that binds you to our prisoner yonder?" For a moment she sat silent, her bosom heaving, her fingers locked tight as iron. Slowly the words came, words broken by sobs, yet clear enough to make my pulses leap. He was my brother's friend, his dearest friend. They swore together to guard a trust, to keep a vow. But he, my brother, died for that vow. Now they call him murderer. Holmes' eyes had kindled to a strange light. He bent forward, his thin hand flashing like a white bird in the gloom. "Your brother, Madam Hisney, Julian Harwood." Holmes sprang erect, his breath hissing through his teeth in that fierce intake I had heard but twice before, when some mighty coil of thought leaped to sudden shape in his brain. "Harwood," he muttered. "Then by all the devils that plot in darkness the circle is closed." For one long moment he stood rigid, every nerve strung like wire, his gaze fixed upon some vision beyond mortal ken. Then he turned swiftly, the fire of triumph in his eyes. "Watson, the last piece is in place. The game is ours." He swung upon the woman, his voice ringing now with the thrill of mastery. "Madam, we have saved more than a life. Few have flung open the door of a mystery that has mocked the keenest wits in England. Within the hour you shall see the truth blaze clear as noon. But now courage. Sit fast, and hold your peace till I call. For when I speak again, the dead shall speak with me." And with that, he swept from the vestry like a white, his cloak swirling, his face aflame with the white fire of discovery. I followed, breathless, knowing that somewhere in the dark heart of that ancient college, the hour of reckoning had struck. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape the night lay heavy over the cloister as we emerged from the vestry. A chill wind moaned through the arches, stirring the ivy into whispering tongues. Holmes strode on like a man possessed, his long figure cleaving the shadows with tireless energy. I hurried at his side, breathless with curiosity and foreboding. "Holmes," I panted, "for pity's sake, what does it mean?" "This vow the dead man Harwood." He cut me short with a gesture. "Not now, Watson. Words are dust till the hour strikes. But mark me before that clock tolls midnight, the truth shall blaze like a sword in the dark." His eyes swept the quadrangle with the hawk-like vigilance that never slept. Then, in a tone that was low, yet edged with steel, he added, "We are watched. Keep close and tread softly." We had scarce turned the angle of the cloister when a shadow leaped from the buttress, a crouching figure, swift and noiseless as a panther. I caught the gleam of steel in the starlight, and a cry burst from my lips. But Holmes was swifter than thought. With a spring like that of a striking snake, he hurled himself upon the shape, and the two went down together in a whirl of struggling limbs. The knife clattered on the stones. I flung myself into the fray, my hands gripping a sinewy arm that writhed like a live thing. The fellow fought with the fury of a beast at bay, his breath hissing through clenched teeth, his muscles straining till I thought the bones must crack. Then came Holmes' voice, cool and hard as tempered steel. "Hold him, Watson. The game is desperate now." With a wrench that shook the man from head to heel, Holmes locked his arms in that grip which no strength could break. Inch by inch, we forced him down, till at last he lay panting, pinned like a felled stag, his dark face livid in the gloom. Holmes bent above him, his eyes burning like live coals. "So," he said softly, "the hunter turns and the quarry strikes. But the chase ends here, my friend. One cry, and half the college is upon us. Will you try your fortune against the rope or speak?" The man's lips writhed in a ghastly grin. "You'll get naught from me," he spat, the words thick with hate. "Hang me if you will live. Held my tongue too long to break now." Holmes' smile was cold as frost. "Bravado, sir, is the last refuge of the doomed. You forget to know the story from first to last. I could whisper your secret in your ear and see the blood leap in your face. Shall I prove it?" The fellow started ever so slightly, yet enough to tell the tale. Holmes bent lower, his voice a hiss of lightning. "The ink that formed across does the name strike deep, and Julian Harwood does that ghost walk by your side." A strangled sound broke from the man's throat. His limbs quivered, his head sank upon his breast. For one breathless instant he lay rigid, then, with the suddenness of a loose spring, he tore himself free, flinging Holmes aside with the strength of frenzy, and dashed like a madman through the archway into the night. "After him, Watson," Holmes cried, and we plunged in pursuit through the cloister. Across the moonlit quad, over the crunching gravel of the path, he flew a black shadow against the silver. My breath came in sobs, my heart pounding like a drum, yet still I ran, my eyes fixed upon the flitting shape that skimmed the ground like a hunted wolf. He reached the outer gate, wrenched it wide, and fled into the lane. Holmes was upon him then, silent as fate, and the two went down together once more. This time the struggle was brief. Holmes' wiry strength, the grip of iron in his lean hands, bore the man helpless to the earth. A moment later, the bracelets clicked upon his wrists. Holmes rose, pale but triumphant, the fire of the chase still flaming in his eyes. "The last throw, Watson," he panted. The man staked all upon that leap hand lost. "Quick now, we must bring him in before the hour strikes. I shall tell a tale that will make these ancient walls ring with a name long buried and a crime black as midnight." And so, with our prisoner between us, we passed once more beneath the shadow of the college towers, knowing that the end of the long game was at hand. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. The narrow lane was deserted as we half dragged, half marched our captive back through the oaken gates of St. Anselm's. The ancient college clock tolled 1/4 to midnight, its iron tongue booming across the silent quadrangle like the knell of doom. The sound struck some echo in the prisoner's soul, for he shuddered and hung his head, the defiance dying from his eyes. Holmes, his lean face pale from the struggle, glanced keenly at me as we passed under the archway. His tone was crisp and almost exultant. "The board is set, Watson, and the last piece falls into place. Did I not tell you the game would be played out before midnight? Even now the web tightens, and there is no strand the spider can break." I gazed at him in bewilderment. "Holmes, I beg you, speak plainly. This man, what part does he play? What is this phantom of Harwood that you hurl in his teeth? You know, and I am still in darkness." Holmes' eyes gleamed with a strange inward fire as he replied, "Patience, my dear fellow. The hour of revelation is at hand, but not yet. There is one move still to make, one thread to draw taut. Till then, silence is our surest ally." We thrust our prisoner into the waiting custody of 2 porters whom Holmes had summoned by a word. The man stood mute and sullen, his wrists clamped in steel, his head sunk upon his breast like one who sees the shadow of the rope in his path. Holmes turned to the senior dean, who had hastened thither in robe and nightcap, his thin face drawn with anxiety. "Sir," said my friend, "place this man under watch in the strong room, and see that none but yourself approaches him. His safety is of the first importance, for, if he escapes or comes to harm, the truth perishes with him." The dean, white to the lips, bowed in silent obedience when we were alone once more. Holmes led me swiftly along the cloister and up a winding stair to a dim-lit study overlooking the quad. He flung himself into the chair by the hearth, clasped his long fingers before his face, and stared into the embers with the rapt gaze of one who beholds visions in the flame. At last he spoke, in that low, thrilling tone which heralded his supreme moments of insight. "Watson, cast back your mind to the vestry. Do you recall the parchment with the inked crossed a broken seal, the words in Latin?" "Perfectly," I answered. "And do you remember the scrap of paper I found in the dead man's clenched hand, the fragment that bore but 3 letters, and those blurred?" "Yes, HR, I think. Just so. Harwood, Watson. Julian Harwood, once a scholar of this very college, expelled in disgrace 15 years ago for a crime that was hushed but not forgotten. A man who swore vengeance on the authorities and vanished from England till now." I sprang to my feet. "You mean," Harwood returned, "that he," Holmes waved me down, softly, softly. I tell you but a corner of the tapestry. The whole design you shall see tomorrow when the pieces lie together in the light. Yet mark this, the murder in the vestry was but the last act of a drama long in weaving. A drama whose roots strike deep into the past. Our prisoner holds the keyboot even without his word. I have the lock well nigh turned. He rose, flung back his shoulders, and his eyes blazed with the fierce joy of the intellect that has triumphed over darkness. One thing more remained uncertain, the motive behind the second stroke. That, I confess, baffled me till tonight. But the dagger thrust in the cloister, the frantic bid for my life, ah Watson, they were not the blind blows of panic. No, they sprang from a deeper spring, a motive black as hate and patient as death itself. And now I have it. He struck the mantel with his open hand, and the sound rang like a pistol shot through the hushed room. Then, with swift reaction, he sank again into his chair, drew the violin to his chin, and as the first low wail stole from the strings, he murmured, "Tomorrow, Watson, the gathering of the clan. Till then, let the music weave a veil for thoughts too stern for sleep. For in that hall yonder, before another sun has set, you shall hear a tale that will make the very stones cry out." And so, with the storm of revelation trembling on the brink, we sat far into the night, the shadow of the gallows and the whisper of a dead man haunting the air like an unspoken curse. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. Great hall of St. Anselm's lay hushed in a pallid light, for dawn had scarcely lifted its gray curtain when Holmes' summons sped through the college. One by one they came, figures drawn from shadowed corridors and silent stairways, their faces pale with sleeplessness and fear. A sense of impending doom clung to the air like the chill before a storm. I watched them file into the chamber where the long oaken table stretched its dark length beneath the solemn portraits of dead scholars. There was the master of the college, stern and haggard; the dean, his thin hands nervously interlaced; the young curate, pale as parchment, his lips moving in silent prayer. Behind them came a cluster of others, tutors, servants, and the sharp-eyed Inspector Lestrade, who bustled importantly about, his air of officialdom thinly masking a growing unease. Holmes stood at the head of the table, his figure erect and singularly commanding in that dim, spectral light. His face wore an expression I had seen but seldom: cold, inexorable, the face of judgment itself. A faint smile touched his lips as his keen eyes swept the assembly. "Gentlemen," he began, and his voice cut the silence like a knife, "I thank you for your prompt obedience. The hour has struck when truth must speak and falsehood be stripped of its last rag of disguise." A stir ran through the group. The young curate half rose, then sank back as though the strength had ebbed from his limbs. The dean's lips quivered as he essayed a word, but Holmes silenced him with a gesture. "You have all played your parts in a drama whose first act opened many years ago, and whose last was played in yonder vestry with the ink that formed a cross." At the mention of that sinister phrase, a shiver swept the hall. Holmes continued, relentless, "I do not propose, for the present, to indulge curiosity. Within the hour you shall know all who struck and why. But mark this, the man who dealt death in the vestry is here within these four walls." A gasp broke from the assembly. I felt the hair bristle on my scalp as the words rang out, hard and metallic. My eyes flew from face to face, seeking some sign of guilt. The curate sat rigid, his fingers clenched. The master's heavy brows were drawn in a black frown. Lestrade's jaw sagged foolishly, and a bead of moisture trickled down his ruddy cheek. Holmes let the silence lengthen till it throbbed with terror. Then, with a sudden change of tone, he spoke almost carelessly. "Before we go further, I must ask the dean to fetch from the strong room the sealed packet entrusted to his keeping last night." The old man rose, trembling, and vanished, returning presently with a flat parcel bound in tape. Holmes took it with a bow, placed it upon the table, and let his long fingers linger on the cover as though it were some fateful talisman. "In this packet," said he slowly, "lies the shadow of a man who has haunted St. Anselm's for 15 bitter years. His name you shall hear anon. For the present, patience." He turned abruptly to Lestrade. "Inspector, the prisoner, let him be brought in." The door swung wide. Between two porters, pale but erect, strode the man we had seized in the cloister, the stranger whose desperate flight had all but cost us our lives. His dark eyes burned with a somber fire as they swept the ring of faces, and his lips curled in a smile that was like the edge of a knife. Holmes met that glance with one as keen, and in it I read the silent clash of two strong spirits, the hunter and the hunted. "Set him yonder," commanded Holmes, pointing to a chair apart. "Guard him well, for till my tale is told, not a man of you stirs from this room." He flung back his coat, drew forth a sheaf of notes, and laid them before him with the precision of a barrister at the bar. Then, lifting his head, he spoke again, his voice vibrant with suppressed triumph. "You shall hear now the story of a wrong long hidden, of vengeance patient as fate, and of a crime as subtle as it was deadly. When I have done, there will be no riddle left, save why blind justice tarried so long upon the road." He paused, and in that breathless hush I felt the very walls lean forward to listen. Chapter 16. The great unraveling. Holmes allowed the hush to deepen until it seemed the great hall had become a echoing only with the quickened breathing of guilty hearts. Then, with a quiet deliberation more terrifying than any burst of passion, he began to speak. "Let us trace the crime from its cradle," said he, spreading his long fingers across the notes. "Not the stroke in the vestry alone, but the impulse that set a hand to murder years ago. For this is no sudden frenzy. Gentlemen, it is a vengeance as cold and patient as winter ice." His eyes swept the group, resting for a moment on the prisoner seated apart. The man returned the gaze with a dark, unfathomable smile. "15 years since," continued Holmes, "a scandal rocked this college. A young scholar, brilliant, ambitious, yet cursed with a fatal flaw, was accused of forging a signature upon a check. Proof was slight, yet suspicion was heavy. He protested innocence, but the evidence of it shamefully we condemned him. Expelled in disgrace, he vanished into the night, leaving behind a name blackened and a heart steeled to one purpose." A murmur stirred the company. I caught the master's face blanch as though a ghost had brushed him. "Years passed," Holmes went on, "but the man lived. He wandered far, learned strange arts of ink and cipher, of poison and disguise, and when he returned, it was not to sue for pardon, but to write across the record of his shame a cross in ink-and blood. I could feel my pulse hammering as Holmes' voice rose and fell like the tolling of a bell. The first link, he resumed more quietly, was forged when that fatal letter came, the letter bidding the dean to a secret meeting. It bore the old college seal, yet the seal was counterfeit. The inket was no common ink, but a preparation devised to baffle analysis, and yet to speak to one eye alone, the eye that knew the symbol traced upon it. Here he held aloft the torn fragment from the vestry table, its dark smear visible even in the dim light. "This," said Holmes, "is the key." A cross formed by two strokes of a pen seemed a mere idle flourish, but to the man who wrote it, and to the man it summoned, it told the whole tale of vengeance waiting in the dark. That cross was the sign of doom. Holmes wheeled suddenly upon the company, his gray eyes gleaming. "Who forged the check 15 years ago? Who gave evidence false, damning evidence? The lad he called his friend. Gentlemen, you know the name." A gasp broke from the dean. The curate uttered a cry and sank back, white as death. But Holmes' voice cut through the tumult like a sword. It was Dr. Willoughby, the master of St. Anne's. The old man staggered to his feet, his hands flung out as though to ward off a blow. "It is false, a devil's lie," he cried hoarsely. Holmes' lip curled in scorn. "False? When the books tell the tale, when the check bears your hand, when this packet," he smote the parcel upon the table, "holds the letters that damn you." A dreadful silence fell. I saw the master's head sink upon his breast, his figure shrunken as though age had swept upon him in a moment, and the avenger. Holmes' voice rang like steel on stone. "He sits yonder silent, smiling, the man you hunted from these walls like a dog. Gentlemen, behold Cyril Mortlake, once scholar of this college, now its nemesis." All eyes were turned upon the prisoner. He rose slowly, proudly, the ghost of that bitter smile upon his lips. "Yes," he said in a low, vibrant tone, "I am Cyril Mortlake. I wrote the cross. I kept my oath, and by the God that made me, if the hour were to come again, I would strike as I struck then." His voice, his bearing, there was a grandeur in his guilt that held us spellbound. Holmes alone remained unmoved. "Enough," said he curtly. "Inspector, the law will deal with this man. My task is done." He gathered his papers with a gesture that dismissed both tragedy and triumph, as one might close a book. Yet I, who knew his moods, read in the sudden droop of his eyelids that deep weariness which comes when the mind, long strung to tension, sinks back into shadow. Chapter 17. The shadow of justice, the silence that followed. Mortlake's confession was broken only by the ticking of the great clock above the hall. It seemed to me that time itself had paused, holding its breath upon the brink of catastrophe. Then, slowly, the sound of heavy boots echoed upon the flagged floor. Inspector Lestrade, who had hitherto stood a little apart, stepped forward, his sharp features set in lines of official resolve. "You have heard the words," said he grimly, "and you, gentlemen, are witnesses. Cyril Mortlake, I arrest you for the willful murder of Dr. James Willoughby." The prisoner did not flinch. His pale face wore that strange smile, still a smile, wherein pride and ruin were curiously interwoven. He bowed slightly, as though the formality were but some idle courtesy, and allowed the handcuffs to clasp his wrists without resistance. "It matters little," he said quietly. "The law claims me, so be it. But know this, the blow I struck was not for gold, nor gain, but for the justice your courts denied me. If there be a higher tribunal than man's, I shall stand there unashamed." His words, uttered with a dignity that no dungeon could degrade, sent a chill through me. For in that moment the murderer seemed less a felon than an avenging spirit, stern and inexorable. The master poor, broken wretch had sunk into a chair, his face hidden in his hands. The weight of years and guilt crushed him down like a felled oak. Not once did he speak, save for a hoarse whisper that drifted to my ear as Lestrade led Mortlake away. "God forgive me, God forgive." Holmes stood apart, his tall figure drawn in shadow against the carved screen. There was no triumph in his bearing, rather an air of profound abstraction, as though his mind wandered far from the human wreckage at his feet. As the door closed upon Mortlake and his escort, the hush deepened once more. It was Holmes who broke it. "The case," said he coldly, "is ended. The law will do its office, and we, Watson, shall return to Baker Street. There is nothing further for us here." "But Holmes," I cried, for my heart was torn with conflicting pity and horror. "The man is guilty, grievously guilty, yet who can deny he was sorely wronged? Is there no room in your philosophy for mercy?" Holmes' lip curved in a bitter smile. "Mercy, my dear fellow, is not mine to give. I am but the instrument that drags truth from its lair. If truth strike like a sword, the fault lies in the evil that provoked it. Come, we have done all that men may do." There was that in his tone which forbade further speech, and so, with a heavy heart, I followed him out into the chill night where the college bells tolled their solemn cadence above the sleeping city. The streets lay silent beneath a vault of frosty stars as our cab rattled eastward. For a long while Holmes spoke no word, his face set like marble against the gloom. At last, as the lamps of Baker Street gleamed before us, he turned with a sudden, weary gesture. "Watson," said he, "if ever you write this case for your chronicles, set down one truth, that human justice, blundering and blind, can breed a crime blacker than that which it would avenge. That is the moral of Mortlake's cross." I gave no answer, for in my soul the question surged like a tide-weather man's codes could ever compass the strange equities of fate. And as the door of our old rooms closed behind us, I felt that the shadows we had left in St. Anselm's were such that no dawn could wholly dispel. Chapter 18. The Last Word. Was 2 nights later that Holmes at last broke the silence which had brooded over him since our return to Baker Street. Throughout the interval he had sat for long hours in his armchair, motionless as a carved figure, save for the thin blue spirals of smoke that curled upward from his pipe. His violin lay untouched in its case. Even the morning papers, so often his companions, lay unopened upon the table. I had respected his abstraction, for I knew too well these moods wherein the machinery of that extraordinary mind ground silently upon its problem until every wheel had come to rest. Yet on this second evening, as the fog drifted against our windows and the glow of the fire threw ruddy flickers upon the walls, Holmes roused himself with a sudden start and turned those keen gray eyes upon me. "Watson," said he, "you are troubled in mind. I have observed it for the past 2 days." "Indeed, Holmes," I confessed. "It has weighed upon me heavily. This man Mortlake was guilty beyond dispute. Yet I cannot banish the thought that his crime was but the child of another wrong. When I recall his words, 'Justice, your courts denied me,' I ask myself whether the law we serve is indeed the highest arbiter." Holmes leaned forward, the firelight cutting strange hollows in his hawk-like face. "My dear fellow," said he, "law is but the ledger wherein society keeps its accounts, a rude instrument fashioned by compromise. But crime springs from the passions that seethe beneath the surface of civilization. When such a passion is thwarted, love turned to gall, ambition to ashes, it will break through every barrier. And in the crash men cry out upon fate. Yet fate is but the sum of little things, such trifles as a drop of ink forming a cross upon a sheet of paper." "The ink!" I exclaimed. "Holmes, you never told me how came that fatal mark to be the pivot of all." He smiled faintly. "Ah, Watson, that was the first thread I seized, though its meaning dawned but slowly. When I examined the dead man's table, I noted that curious blot, the ink flowing outward as though from a tremor of the hand, the lines forming a crude cross. Why should a scholar, calm in his study, trace such a sign at the instant of death? Clearly the hand was not his own, but another's pressed down upon his as he wrote. Hence, the death was not a sudden seizure, but violence cloaked beneath a semblance of peace. "But why the cross?" I persisted, a signal half-conscious, perhaps, of a vow fulfilled. When Mortlake spoke of the day when the ink should write the cross, I knew the symbol was his doom mark. His letters, his journals, all pointed to that bitter wrong when Willoughby robbed him both of honor and of love. Add to this the altered will, drawn in secret, and the absence of forced entry, what conclusion remained? The old scholar had summoned his foe to parley, and in that hour the retribution of years fell swift and silent. The hand that wrote the cross was the hand that struck the blow. I sat marveling, as ever, at the chain of reasoning, so clear now, so dark before. "And yet," said I slowly, "though the man is taken and the law appeased, I cannot feel exultation. Rather it seems that tragedy has stalked across the cloisters of St. Anselm, leaving to wrecked lives where once were friendship and learning." Holmes rose, and, standing with his back to the fire, flung out his long arms in a gesture that was half protest, half weariness. "Watson," he said, "when you have lived as I have lived, when you have sounded the depths where greed and hate lie coiled, you will cease to seek romance in human destinies. There is no drama deeper than the commonplace when passion strikes its root therein. This case, with all its dark color, is but a variant of the eternal theme, the weak preyed upon by the strong, and strength in turn shattered by the weakness it provoked. To us it is an intellectual exercise. To them it was life and death." He moved toward the window and drew aside the curtain. The fog had lifted. A clear moon hung above the housetops, serene and passionless. Holmes stood for a moment, his figure etched against the pale light, then let the curtain fall and turned back with a shrug. "And now, Watson," said he, briskly, the old note of irony returning to his voice, "shall we dismiss Mortlake and his ink-stained cross? Mrs. Hudson has secured some excellent cigars, and I perceive that Lestrade, bless his unimaginative soul, has sent us a box of the best as a token of gratitude. The world rolls on, my dear fellow, and we roll with it. Pray hand me the matches. And so, with the smoke wreathing upward in blue spirals, and the fire purring low upon the hearth, the tragedy of St. Anselm's passed into that shadowy gallery where dwelled the memories of Sherlock Holmes, grim, inscrutable, and strangely human.